G'day everyone, my name is Tom Craig and you're listening to my podcast, The Help Side, where we speak to some of the most recognisable names in world hockey and get an insight into who they are, what they're about, and what makes them tick. Now, if you like what you hear, feel free to follow our socials at The Help Side on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. We'd absolutely love that. Now, this week we've got our first special edition Help Side. And by that, I mean technically, our interviewee is not actually a hockey player. That being said, listeners of the show will know that he's already been a fixture of the Help Side. And it only seemed fitting that we get John Eales on the show to give us his side of the story that Mick McCann told us about that night after the Kookaburra's gold medal win in Athens. Without any shadow of overstatement, John Eales can rightly be called one of Australia's greatest sporting heroes. Between 1991 and 2001, John represented Australia's rugby union team, the Wallabies, in 86 test matches and was captain for 55 of those. He went to 3 World Cups, and in winning 2 of those, John played a role in establishing the Wallabies of the 90s as one of Australia's most successful sporting teams, and has become known as one of Australia's most successful sporting captains ever. When it comes to Aussie sporting icons, it really doesn't get much bigger. John has been inducted into the International Rugby Board Hall of Fame, the Australian Institute of Sport Hall of Fame, the Sport Australia Hall of Fame, and the Rugby Australia Hall of Fame. He's also been awarded an Order of Australia medal for his contribution to rugby and, to cap it all off, even the medal awarded annually to the best rugby player in Australia is named after him, the John Eales Medal. This morning, I was lucky enough to sit down with John over a cup of tea and a coffee and discuss some of the highs and lows of his sporting career and what it took to elevate that Wallabies team to legend status. In this interview, you'll hear John's account of his dealings with hockey over the years, as well as a slightly different perspective of the Olympic Games, that of an Olympic athlete liaison officer. With his trademark humility, John talks about dealing with pressure as both an athlete and a captain, and what separates the great teams from the good. Finally, having been involved with rugby during the transitional period between amateur and professional, we discuss some of the challenges that brings, and where hockey might learn from the experiences of rugby union, should it follow similarly down that path. This is the Help Side of John Eales, AM. Please enjoy. A huge pleasure of mine to be sitting with a different guest today, not a hockey player, but one of the greats of Australian sport, John Eales. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Tom.
My podcast is called The Help Side, by the way, so you're our first non-hockey guest of The Help Side. And you've actually featured on the show before. Mick McCann spoke a couple of weeks ago about some of the things you get up to in Athens on when they won their gold medal. And I just want to talk a little bit about that Athens game and what it was like from your perspective and that night in Athens.
Yeah, look, I think I still say, a lot of people say, well, what's the best sporting event you've been to? And if I was to take my own sport out of it, take rugby out of it, because that would be in the top few places. I would think some of the things I've been to and seen and been involved with. But outside of that Kookaburra's win that night in Athens is probably the night of sport, or the event of sport that I enjoyed the most. I was just in the crowd that day, but I'd had a little bit to do with the Kookaburras in the lead up, and spent a bit of time with some of the guys and with Barry Dancer and Batchy as well, and the coaching staff among some of the rest of the management. And so I felt I'd got to know them a bit, the guys, and had really enjoyed working with them, and loved watching their work ethic, loved watching the way that they prepared for these for this whole tournament. And they had never won a gold medal, had come so close so many times. So you knew there was that sense that it was a really special occasion. And then when it was all drawn at full time, well, first it probably should go back actually, because first there was people getting on the bus to go out to the hockey stadium, and not everyone had their accreditation. I had my Infinity Pass, which was good value, and so I could get in. But I think out of the probably 50 or 60 people on the 2 buses that went out, I think maybe 6 or 7 had official accreditation, and we were led by the great Laurie Lawrence, and he suggested that he'd be able to talk his way in. There was one security guard there. I think he started to talk his way through, and the guy saying no, and so he's just gestured for everyone to run, and so everyone just ran in and dispersed around the stadium, and it was quite funny. And look, I remember the game, drawn at full time, and I was actually expecting that there would be a full lot of extra time played. So when we scored the goal, when Jamie scored the goal, I thought, oh, that's great, got the lead here, but they've got to focus. And I thought, oh, look, they're actually getting a bit too excited here. They've got to get back and concentrate. But then someone said, no, it's golden goal. And so I realised that they had won, which was pretty special. And then I managed with, I think it was with James Tompkins, we found our way to the shed, a bit sheepishly, because you don't want to jump in on someone else's celebration. But the guys invited us in and then realised that they didn't have enough to celebrate with. I think there was only 1 or 2 bottles of champagne and maybe a couple of beers, so I went looking for some more. And
can I ask how you secured? Because it was 2 cases of beer, wasn't it?
It was 2 cases. So they used to shut up the hospitality pretty quickly in Greece, in Athens. And I remember going to one event section, and they were shut down. They didn't have anything. Went to another. I think it might have been the second or third that I went to. There was one guy left there, and I said, mate, there's a team down there. They've just won the gold medal. It's the first time that the Kookaburras have ever won this Olympic gold medal, and they've got nothing to celebrate with. And he said, oh, no, sorry, we've got nothing. And I could see that they did have some beers in the fridge. And so I said, I had no money on me, or nothing substantial. There was no taking a credit card or anything like that. So I was thinking, well, what do I have? And literally all I had was the shirt on my back, and it had Australia on there. And I said, would you swap this for some beer? And he said, oh, okay. I said, well, it's 2 cases. And so I gave him my shirt, and he gave me 2 cases of beer. And then I had to walk through the stadium back around with 2 cases of beer, and I brought them in, but I was shirtless, and Troy Elder gave me his warm-up top, which I've still got. So that was very good, and great memento for the occasion for me.
Brilliant.
Troy missed his shirt from then on, I'm sure, but no, it was good, and I was able to share a drink with the boys.
Brilliant. I have to ask, I've heard the Laurie Lawrence story a few times. Everyone just makes a break through the gate. What happens after? I mean, like, it's as if you got in and then it's like a safe zone. No one can kick you out. You're completely fine. Or did you have people hunting you down?
Well, there was mainly just the one guy there. Like, literally. It was because there was a number of gates around the place, and it must have been the athletes' entrance. And so there weren't as many people. And it was basically right on almost at the start time of the game. So I think there wasn't as much activity. And once people got through, and they kept going through and through and through, they just dispersed through all parts of the stadium. And I can't remember. I presume not all of it was designated seating. So they just found their way around, and after that, no one got kicked out. Look, you could not do that these days. No way. You just couldn't do it. And Athens is probably one of the last places you could do something like that.
It's definitely a great Australian Olympic story. So you got in with your Infinity Pass, which you mentioned, but that you had in the capacity of being an athlete liaison officer in Athens. That's a very different role. It's an interesting role. Obviously, with the Kookaburras, you were attached to that team, but I'm interested in, when you were attached to that team, did you feel something special was brewing beforehand? Was there a sense that they were on for that game, or? Yeah,
look, there definitely was that sense, and I had the opportunity to meet with the team in a couple of lead-up games that they had in Sydney, and they were playing against South Africa, and it was the first serious hockey I'd watched, and I grew to love it, and still to this day love watching a game. And just because I wasn't exposed to that growing up, and my sports were cricket and rugby, played a bit of golf and stuff like that. So I hadn't, because you're so busy and immersed in those, you don't always get to see a lot of others. And you watch a bit at the Olympics, but you're probably mainly watching the major rounds a lot of the time. And so I had the opportunity to go along and watch a game and sit next to some of the guys and really get to understand what's happening, why things were happening. And And so they made me feel very welcome in that environment. And as the athlete liaison officer in that role, I suppose there's a few different ways you can handle it. You can either be quite forward and pushing yourself on the team, and that's certainly not my style. My style was more sit back, talk, be available when people want you to be available. And Barry and the leadership group of the team were really good at just inviting me in at different stages, asked me to speak to them a couple of times, or you might just have the opportunity to speak to different coaches or different athletes in the team. And so it was a great honour, really, to be involved. And as I said, I didn't push myself onto it, but it was, I really felt welcome. And a very small part of it, which was great.
You went to 3 Olympics as an athlete liaison officer. You would have seen a lot of, worked with a lot of athletes, some successful, some unsuccessful. Was there any discernible difference that you can think of in reflection that would indicate that they were going to achieve or they weren't going to achieve, insofar as maybe the pressure, or because it's a tough environment, obviously?
Yeah, but very, very tough environment, Tom. And I think I suppose the first thing is to understand, what does success mean for that athlete? Because the podium is not necessarily success. Like, for some, a bronze is losing, and for some, a bronze is an absolute victory. And for some, they know they're not going to get on anywhere near the podium. So it's just how it's the experience of it all and getting out there and being at their best. So you were, like, in the role, you were dealing with people, through that whole spectrum, and some were seeking you out before they competed, others were seeking you out after they competed, and sometimes you were a shoulder to cry on, sometimes you were just, someone who could help clear a head before or give a specific focus before they had something, whatever it was that they were doing. So I think just being prepared to be a little bit of all of that, as and when needed. And certainly my experience in a team sport, my experience as a leader in that team sport environment, I think was pretty useful for some, where they could relate to what you're talking about and the experiences that they were going through. And some really interesting ones, like I sort of look back and think Damon Kelly was a weightlifter, and actually being there, going to training, and Deborah Lovely was another weightlifter for Australia, and just being there in the back room as they're preparing to go out there on stage to lift in an Olympic Games was an extraordinary experience. Like, I used to love watching the weightlifting, when I was, even to this day. But being in that back area when they're preparing, and again, not imposing yourself and just waiting to be called in to help where you can. But it was fascinating. I really learnt an enormous amount from that environment. Can you tell us a bit about that? What's it like in the back room? Because we only see them come out and lift thousands of kilos. What's that? Yeah, look, I think it's different. This is where, as an athlete, you'd understand that everyone has their own way of preparing, and everyone has their way of getting themselves to that optimum level of arousal. So you're looking around, you're conscious of the privilege you have, and you don't want to interfere with anyone. But there are individual spaces, and you look across the room and you see some people that are, and you remember back to your football days, some people had to be super psyched to get out there and do their best, and some were really calm and in that process. So I suppose it was understanding the athlete that you were with and knowing what they wanted and trying to be that for them, which generally wasn't very much, because they had their coaches, and the last thing you wanted to do was interfere and create an environment that was different for them, to take them out of the how they had prepared. So, but they wouldn't have invited me in if they were concerned about that or concerned about my personality in that environment. So, but it was fascinating to just see the way that they would mentally prepare to do something that was such a physical challenge. Very cool. I'm going to talk about you a little bit now, and your career. Obviously, you had a lot to offer as an athlete liaison officer, but you achieved a fair amount on the field as well. We've had on this podcast before a few Hockeyroos from that golden 1990s era, and I think it's fair to say that two of the great Australian sporting teams
both existed in that era. One was the Hockeyroos and another one was your Wallabies. And I just want to talk about the difference between good teams, of which there are many, and the great teams, of which there are very, very few. Is there a clear difference between those two? And in your experience, what is it?
I think it's the fine margins between those two, because physically there's probably not that much difference between the good and the great teams. Look, I mean, there will be some great players, but I sort of look at the Wallabies and our development through that period of time, and I was fortunate. I came into a team that was almost at the top of its game. They'd been through some really tough times, and I came in at 1991, and it was a World Cup year, and they had just had a breakthrough win over New Zealand the year before, but they were quite inconsistent. But they started to develop this consistency, and then we had a great year, won 9 out of the 10 Test matches, including the World Cup final against England, but only lost 1 game to New Zealand by 3 points that year. And then I was part of that team that was very good for a number of years, and then we went down as there was a bit of a change in the guard of the players. Few people, key players, probably had injuries, and then 95 World Cup, for all the reasons 91 was brilliant, 95 was so disappointing because we had potential and we just weren't able to turn that potential into performance at the time. So, and then we came 96, I became captain, and we had some really tough years. Like, we won some good games, we couldn't beat the All Blacks, we were very inconsistent. We were scraping home in games against teams that we should have been probably beating by a bit more. We did some really good things, but as I say, we were inconsistent. But I look at the team, and then at the end of 1997, Rod McQueen took over as coach. And Rod was outstanding. Some people say, look, he was more a manager than a coach, but yeah, that's so far from the truth, because he had this deep understanding of what it took to play rugby, and he got people around him. He created a team of people around him who were better than him in different areas, different parts of the game, and he was not threatened at all about that. In fact, he embraced that, but he was still on top of everything and driving the whole outcome, as well as some of the pieces of that outcome. But what was interesting, I think, I always often reflect on, is that no one who ended up playing in the World Cup final in 1999 debuted for the Wallabies after 1997. And so in 1997, at the time where all these people would have debuted already, we were considered one of the worst Australian teams ever. Yeah, we had just suffered the test match before Rod McQueen took over. Was a test in Pretoria in South Africa, and it was the biggest score ever against the Wallabies. Wasn't the biggest margin because the year before we'd done that against the Kiwis. So there was these, we had records that you don't want to have on your watch. But yet all the players that were playing, so the players didn't all of a sudden get more talented. In some ways, I don't think they actually got more passionate because they were incredibly passionate, but we just weren't winning. We just weren't very good. But they did get more experienced, and they were very much guided to say, okay, this is your talent. This is the talent of the team. How do we build a winning strategy using that talent? And so I think it's not necessarily the physical capability of those people, but it was definitely a change in focus, a change in culture of the team, a change in the standards that we accepted and the standards that we wouldn't accept in the team. And so that, for me, is the biggest difference between good and the great.
That's interesting. So obviously some poor, not poor experiences, but let's say formative experiences. I'd imagine there would be a lot of teams that would pass by the wayside, not cashing in on those experiences, so to speak. As the captain in 99 and obviously working closely with Rod, is there a way that you actively harnessed those negative experiences or those tough losses to serve you better in the future?
Yeah, we did. And part of it was you focus on it and say, we never want to go back there. But I think you need to understand why you were there in the first place. Like, it can't just be this passionate, oh, we're not going to lose, we're not going to lose, not going to give in, we're just going to keep fighting. That has some merit, but it only has really valuable merit, maximum merit, if you like, if you can fill in all the reasons why you weren't successful back then. And for us, it would have been, look, we had Greg Smith as a coach, and he was very, very good in some ways, and we worked hard, but we probably didn't work as smartly. Well, we didn't as what we did when Rod came in, because he had a much clearer articulation of a plan and what the athletes need. And I think also there was this bit of a cultural change as well, where we came through this era where sports science started to come to the fore, and I think in 91 we were at the forefront of some of that. But then sometimes sports science, there is a, like as with most things, there's a bell curve, like the absolute peak of the usefulness of sports science. And then I think if you use too much, you can get to the point where people start using it as an excuse not to do things rather than a way to do things. And some of us, I think, and the team in some ways and individuals went over that edge of the maximum benefit of sports science. So when Rod came in some ways, he had to dumb us down. And in other ways, he had to smarten us up. And it was knowing which levers to pull on each of those. So rather than being, guys say, oh, look, I need to freshen up. I need, I've got heavy legs. I'm not going to do it today. Sometimes we just push through that. And, we had a guy, Steve Nance, who had worked with the Broncos. He came in as our fitness trainer. And he worked us hard. Like, I think as I said, we worked really hard with Greg Smith, and under his regime, I don't think we necessarily worked harder, but there was less people who'd sit out sessions.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, okay, if you might have 80%, 70-80% working, doing everything under Greg, but then there'd be 30%, then they might play on the weekend. Well, all of a sudden, if these guys weren't fit enough to train, well then, okay, they have to sit out a couple of games very quickly. People were putting in and not using science as an excuse anymore.
That's a really interesting point. Stephanie Rice tells a very good story about how she won a gold medal in Beijing. I think it was the 200 or the 400 IM. She won the gold medal, and then she was loving life. She had a gold medal around her neck, and then a couple of days later she had to back it up with a 400 or vice versa. And she came down with a Beijing illness, like many would have. And so her warm-up was a mess, and she scraped through the final. Her warm-up was a mess in the final. And she said that there was a moment where she figured, like, look, all my routines are out the window. I feel terrible. I can either perform, I can either try, give it a go, or I can just retire the race and no one would blame me either way. And she ended up winning the race and setting a world record or something like that. And my question to you is, sometimes when teams aren't going so well, in hindsight, people will say, my legs are heavy, or I just, I wasn't in the right physical prep. But is there a way, did you ever feel like that? You felt that your legs were heavy before a game or something like that? And how did you push through that?
Oh, look, I think in a contact sport like rugby, and probably in every sport, because some sports there may not be the contact, but you're still finely tuned. You rarely feel 100%. Most of the time you're playing with some ailment of some description. So I think a lot of it then, if that's the case, like a lot of it is in the mind. Like how are you going to push through this? How can you put this out of your mind so you can absolutely perform in the moment? And I think it's the people who can take, ultimately sport is about, and performance in life really is about dealing with pressure. And everyone has pressure. But some people are able to remove that pressure from the moment for themselves. And how they're able to do that, well, that'll be different in different people's circumstances. It's going to be different from a team perspective as it will be from an individual perspective. But I think that is probably the greatest gift of experience, is being able to develop the art of removing the pressure from a situation. And pressure can be a physical pressure, it could be a mental pressure as well.
One action of yours springs to mind, 2000 Bledisloe Cup final. Sterling Mortlock was the kicker. He was off. you had to step up to kick. But I went back and had a look at the footage actually, and for those of you who don't know, have a look at the footage. But the Wallabies behind by 2, 3 points to seal a Bledisloe win in New Zealand. And it looks a lot like, without hesitation, straight up to the ref, and said, "We'll take the 3." And that's really what it looked like. No hesitation whatsoever. You knew that what you had to do. You knew you had to kick the goal. Talk to me about the pressure in that situation. Did you feel pressure, or?
Yeah, of course you feel pressure, but it's. I think by that stage I'm 30, year out from retiring. I'd been through these situations a lot of times, and so maybe not quite that big, but you learn. Yeah, if you can perform in the when the pressure's not so big, and you've got the same processes that get you through there, they'll get you through when you're in those moments. Look, you're right. Like initially, I thought, of course we say we're taking the kick. Mm-hmm. Like there's no other decision to make there. But I did think Sterling was still on the field, and I didn't realise he'd been taken off. So I'm looking around for him, and Jeremy Paul said, "Mate, Sterling's off." So I knew it was my kick. If I didn't take it, it would have been pretty lame. Once that happened, I have a different feeling going through me, and it's part excitement because genuinely, like as a kid growing up in the backyard, you do that 1,000 times, and it's what you dream about. You dream about having that moment in a test match when it's on your head, but then like there's that side, so you're excited, but you're also what's at stake, and so you get this rush of adrenaline, hormones through your body. So I think the key, what I had worked out over many years and many years of not being successful in some of those moments, you do have to be able to just shut out the occasion. And so for me, it's I used to have my same routine every time, and I developed this routine early on. Like when I was younger and had the kicking responsibility, I used to sometimes go to bed the night before, and this sounds very weak, and it was weak, but I'd go to bed the night before thinking, I hope I don't have a kick to win the game tomorrow. And then I realised after a while of going into games, and you might get the first one and then get 7 out of 7, you might miss the first and get 1 out of 7, and you have all this great fluctuation. Like physically you can kick. That wasn't an issue. You've got a technique. But there was something missing in those early stages. And I was probably 21, 22 back then, having the odd kick for Queensland and stuff. And then pretty quickly I realised I need to develop a routine here because that's what can protect me. And so I developed, like I used to do the same thing every time. I would line up the ball according to the weather, the wind, whatever. Take 3 steps back, 3 steps across, and then say to myself 3 things. The first one would be head down. When I said head down, I'd pick a specific stitch on the ball. Second one, I'd say slow, because you're never going to go too slow in a game, but you can go too quickly. So head down, slow, and then the last one would be follow through to the posts. And I know that if I did those 3 things, it's going to should go over 80 to 90% of the time. As soon as you don't do one of those things, maybe it's 50% of the time. It goes back to a bit of luck, chance or magic that'll get it over or not. So, but the other thing that does is it takes this big overwhelming, here's a kick to win the game, takes it down to this one moment where you can basically say, okay, it's head down, slow, follow through to the post. I can do that. No one can stop me doing that. So then it was up to me. And then you own it again, and you're still sort of suppressing all the other emotion, but you're doing it in a manner that you've proven to yourself time and time again. And you want to train this because, like, and for me, it was like if we had just had a heavy scrum session, because of you would get more leg heavy in the forwards than you would in the backs. You're doing a lot more scrums, probably heavier leg weights and all that. And so at the end of a big scrum session, I would often, before running over to do line-outs or running over to do a team run, I'd just run over and take 1 or 2 shots at goal, from wherever on the field, but make sure I could slip straight from a heavy session into 2, 1, it might only be 1, but a perfect routine and having a shot. And so that's what I started to do a lot more of, which enabled me to practice under certain pressure, but really just reinforce that routine.
I'm going to briefly interrupt John for a second because I have some exciting news. It's finally time to announce the hero of hockey who's the winner of the Voodoo prize pack valued at 600 Aussie dollars. Now, we started this segment because we know that community hockey is run on the hard work of passionate volunteers, and we wanted to give you, the listener, the opportunity to publicly acknowledge them and their contributions to our great sport. Thanks to everyone who wrote in. We've heard some wonderful stories about some great people because of you, and I hope you used your Voodoo voucher on something juicy in the store. We're going to try to continue with the segment sporadically, so please keep writing in via our socials and telling us all about the heroes who deserve a mention, and we'll try our very best to give it to them. Now, the winner of the Voodoo prize pack, and I might add this was drawn completely randomly out of my own hat, is Travis Carstens from the Campbelltown Collegiate Hockey Club, who I'm pretty sure was our hero of hockey last week with Jane Claxton. Nevertheless, well done, Travis. We'll get in contact with regards to your prize, and thanks again to everyone else who participated. We've absolutely loved hearing your stories and enjoyed doing that segment immensely. Thanks again. Now, let's get back to John. As a captain, obviously, you had responsibilities outside only looking after your own game. I mean, it's controllable what you can do, but when you're the leader of 15 men who can't necessarily control, how did you see pressure affecting them, and did you have any techniques to alleviating the pressure or helping them deal with the pressure?
I think the first thing is you need to understand that everyone is different, and so everyone will have a different way of letting you in or keeping you out. And so once you start to unlock those different ways, then you can start to actually deal with people, as an individual, which is how you get the most out of them. So you would see some people needed very little help. Like you had a guy like Stephen Larkham who was just so calm and composed all the time. And, just an outstanding footballer. He'd be relaxed in the corner of the change room. Everyone else is getting hyped up, ready to go, and he's just sort of sitting there very relaxed. He would have his own nerves, but he's got his own way of dealing with it. There's very little anyone can do to help Stephen Larkham in those moments because he's in control. But there might be other guys that you can see and you just know that a quiet word with them is going to be useful. And some people in the change room, it's such a personal experience in the change room, but it's a group experience as well. And you know that there's some people who are really quiet and you want to leave them as quiet. Some people talk a lot and you listen to every word they say. Or some people, won't say much, but you'll listen to every word they say because you know it'll be spot on. Some people talk a lot and you know you won't have to listen to anything they say because they'll be talking more for themselves rather than for everyone else. And that's fine too. And so you get all this group of people that are doing their own things, but working together to do something as a team. So I think that acceptance of the individual and understanding of the individual is really important.
Did you get to the level where you were able to pick up on when people perhaps weren't successfully implementing their own technique to dealing with pressure? Could you see that? Could you feel the change room in that sense? Or
I think some people you could just sense, particularly the ones you're working closer with in your units and stuff, you could just sense they weren't right. But I think through those years, and particularly say in the latter part of my career, when I was captain, from 96, 97, were tougher years, as I mentioned. Then 98, 99, 2000, 2001 were really good years. And part of the reason was there was so many leaders in that team. Like everyone was willing to, everyone knew that there was a moment they had to step up. Everyone knew that they had something that they were, a way in which they were leading the team. So that's, that was really, getting to know that and knowing you could trust people to own different parts of the team's performance. And even the greats, sometimes you can see they're off their game for different reasons. So you would be looking and sometimes they would pick you up as well. And look, I remember it's probably slightly off topic here, but in 2000 we were playing South Africa in Melbourne, and it might have been one of the first of the Mandela plates which we play for now. And my grandmother had passed away through the week, and everyone knew she was Italian. She was almost a week short of 97. But most of the guys in the team had known her. A lot of them had been over for dinner. They knew how important she was in my life. And so we had been in camp at Caloundra. I think it was Caloundra. I'm pretty sure. Anyway, we'd been in camp beforehand. And maybe it was in Coffs Harbour by that stage. Anyway, it was wherever we were in camp. I found out that she was dying, and so I went, and they all went to Melbourne, and I stayed in Brisbane just for an extra day and flew down after she passed away. And then that Saturday night at the game, and none of them had said anything, but I saw them all putting black armbands on, and I was sort of wondering, and George was the vice captain. He said, "Oh mate, they're for Nonna, my Italian grandmother," and like in a sense, they were watching out for me. They knew that she was someone that I'd grown up with. She lived with me from when I was born, and was incredibly close to me and our family. And so having a team that's really attuned to everyone in small ways, but really important ways, was something that I think each of us were good at in that team.
Sounds like a wonderful team. With captaincy, obviously, there's all the preparation you can do before the game, but as we know, momentum is a funny thing especially international sport, and sometimes without really being able to put your finger on it, you can just feel momentum either with you or against you. And again, I would say that it's everyone's responsibility to try and wrestle that back, but perhaps as a captain, there's more responsibility to firstly perhaps acknowledge that the momentum is away from you or with you, and to address it accordingly. Is that something that you actively thought about in your career?
Yeah, momentum is a big thing, as you say, and we used to think if it was going for you, you just want to keep it going. But the harder time is when it turns against you, and you can feel like you're in this rut. And what do we do? And we used to, we'd plan for these moments. So you plan for when it was going against you. What would you do? And sometimes we'd basically start any given week doing a really complete analysis of the team we're up against. And then that analysis would distill down to the tactics, do the broad analysis. Okay, then tactically, how are we going to approach this game against this team? What were the key things? And in essence, you'd come down, of course, there was the regular skills you had to do, but in essence, you'd come down to, we'd try to bring it down to 2 or 3 words that were going to be the key words for us that week. And so when it came to the 40 seconds you had, when you're pulling into a huddle just before kickoff, you could talk about either 1, 2 or 3 of those words in just really brief terms. And that would give the team a very clear focus. Like it might be one word, but okay, that's a very clear focus for how we want to play the game or switch on. So that became very useful in these moments in a game where things were turning against you. You could just bring it back down to one quick focus, because you don't have time to workshop things. When you're out there on the field, you have to be able to act really quickly and to give some guidance really quickly. So I think a lot of things which look natural out on the field have been manufactured in pre-production before you get out there. So it looks normal, it looks like it just flows, but there's been so much thought and effort put into that. So if and sometimes it just needs the simplest message. Like it might be as simple as, what do we... I'm just trying to think of a word. We might have had this 20 years ago, Tom, so we've got to go back. But one might have been hang, and the word might have been hang, and that would have been to talk about, make sure we come from depth, or when we're not just all running flat, that when we're following from depth in behind, so that gives people plenty of options. Or it might be channels, so we want to drive through particular channels in the field in a big way. So I'm just trying to think. Well, one might be, I forget what it might have been. Start again or build. Build was one actually. And so after you might have just scored a try, you got 7 points against the All Blacks, but that's not worth a lot. That can be lost pretty quickly. So we'd come back and the call would be build around the team. And build meant you go back to your basic structures. You work hard again. It's 0-all. You've just got to start as if you're starting the game again. So you don't lose that advantage you've just created. And I think also sometimes when things are going terribly wrong, and I think back to a game in 2000 in Sydney, the Bledisloe Cup game, and there was a world record crowd. It was one of the test events before the Olympics in 2000. So there was just short of 110,000 people at the stadium. So massive crowd. And the first 8 minutes of the game, we're down by 24 points to 0. Now that's a disaster. I remember being behind the goals that day, and you're thinking, "What the hell do we say?" This could be my last test for the Wallabies, and could be a few of our last tests. If we don't change this. And I just remember saying, "Okay, guys, we've just got to." We hadn't held the ball. Get the ball, hold it, and move towards their line. And we had to get it as simple as that, and we did that in the next play pretty much, or pretty soon afterwards. And Stephen Larkham, bit of magic, got a pass away to Sterling Mortlock, big gap. He ran 40 metres and scored. And all of a sudden we were back in. And that momentum changed and shifted because we were able to just focus on the basics and one simple thing. And then it was 24-all at half-time. And then we were leading with 2 minutes to go. And Jonah Lomu scores a try in the dying minutes. But
I actually, that game touted the game of the century, I think, actually. I remember I actually watched it. I've seen it a few times.
Yeah.
But I remember I watched it a couple of months ago just because it popped up somewhere on Fox Sports or whatever. Unbelievable game of sport.
Yeah.
Phenomenal game of sport. That's cool having some insight into how you come back to 24. I mean, that's not a situation that anyone wants to be in. Or perhaps you do want to be in that situation just so you can show you can claw your way.
You never seek to be in those situations. You're pleased when you can get in them and get out of them as quickly as possible. But look, that was pretty grim. And but look, I remember walking off the field at the end of that game, and you knew that you had been part of something special. Yeah. Sometimes you just know that. And we had lost, but you didn't walk off the field feeling like a loser. Like the scoreboard said, we did not win that game, but there was this incredible feeling of belief in that team through that era. And everyone was down in the shed, of course. But there was also this bit of electricity there as well, where people were really proud of what we'd done. And they were proud of the game that we'd just been a part of. And I'd rather have played a game like that and lost than never to have played that game.
Yeah, for sure. Talking of formative experiences, we've spoken a bit about some as a team, and I want to talk a little bit about some for you personally. Incredibly successful captain and athlete, but I want to talk about some of the times where it perhaps didn't go right, maybe earlier in your career, perhaps times where you didn't handle the pressure well. Can you remember any of those?
Yeah, there were a lot of those, and I think I think I gave the example earlier of kicking, and that was always like something that I was very inconsistent at. I had to work very hard at. I think coming back from injuries was was difficult. I had a couple of rotator cuff repairs, which were major injuries, and coming back, like getting the confidence to be yourself. And I think also particularly, when I was initially captain, like we really struggled, through some tough times, and I got some great advice going to be captain. And I said, "Look, just be yourself." And I think we were talking the other day, and you said you've heard that advice from a number of people, but I've got this great advice from people, but ultimately try to be a little bit of that person, a little bit of that person, a little bit of that person, and you do have these little mini crises of confidence. And like I always thought that it was something I never coveted, being captain of the Wallabies, but when the opportunity came, I really embraced it. I don't think I was very good at it initially, but I think being not very good at it and working my way through that with support of different people inside and outside rugby. Some great friends and people who were willing to tell me what I needed to hear, not what I wanted to hear. Were through that period of time, it really helped me a lot along the journey, and some people left of centre that really challenged me, and I think hearing that from people made a difference.
I just want to move on to segue to the amateur versus professional sporting side of things, because you worked and lived through an era which perhaps hockey finds itself in now. Different circumstances, obviously. We don't have the big financial backing that was pushed towards rugby's way, but I just want to talk about your experience with shifting that landscape, basically. Can you talk a little bit about that? Do you remember what it was like, the change?
Oh, look, I remember this time so clearly because it was a difficult time too, because like half my career was as an amateur and half as a professional, and I'm so pleased to have had both those experiences and really pleased to have been involved in that transition. Not because the transition was easy, it was welcome, but it wasn't easy, because you had to fight there were fights between establishment and a rebel rugby corporation coming in. Yeah, there was difficulties with some teammates who, maybe some towards the end of their careers, some who really were feeling they were missing out, some who wanted money but not accountability, some who, whereas you were in this environment where everyone got the same, nothing, and then all of a sudden they were going to start valuing people at different levels, and they were people who were putting in the same effort, but that was an adjustment to make for some people, and some people didn't see that as being right, but I think it was just a reality of what we were going through. But some of the personal issues through that time were really difficult, I found. And you're young, you're inexperienced, commercially you're naive, you're signing confidentiality agreements, and you're petrified you can lose everything. Not that I had anything to lose at that point in time. So there were things, you take them very literally, and so I wasn't even talking to my parents about some of these really big things that were going on, and they were, like I know now as a parent, how hard that can be. Not having kids that aren't communicating with you, and you know that they're going through some tough times. You wish that they would communicate with you, but Mum and Dad were very, very good at just letting me be and letting me find my own way if that's what I wanted. You could see they were almost bursting to come out and wanting to help or listen or understand a bit more, and I knew they were always there, but I also felt here were things I just had to deal with myself. So it was difficult, and people might think, oh, look, how can it be difficult? You're going from earning nothing to earning good wages, sports turning professional. But there were a lot of battles through that time, and I'm sure some people said things through that time that they'd regret to this day, but it was difficult. And then just adjusting to the new level of accountability that people had. But what I really valued through that time was seeing some people, and my second row partner at the time was Rod McCall, and he was a guy that was towards the end of his career. He wasn't going to reap the benefits of professionalism, but he worked really hard to drive the game to be a professional game. And it was that selflessness of people of that generation that I think was really important in driving it. And then you have the challenges when you do get through. You know that you want some things to mean exactly the same. You want it to mean exactly the same for someone to pull on a jersey as a professional as it did when the sport was amateur. And so we were conscious of that, and we tried to introduce a few things, like we invited a classic Wallaby to come and present the jerseys before every game. And they'd talk about what it meant for them to play for the Wallabies. And that reminded guys that they weren't just this moment in time. That even though it was professional, you were representing 100 years of history before you, and you're the ones who paving the way for all the people who will come after you. So there were some challenges in that time.
I find it fascinating. We were speaking before about how fiercely amateur rugby was. I mean, you couldn't not earn a cent in any way.
Yeah, well, when I first started, it started to relax in a few ways, but if you went and spoke at something, you weren't allowed to earn money. So you'd end up with the bottle of scotch and the crystal glasses. But you weren't allowed to get paid for it. And then it started to... you weren't allowed to get paid from anything that was remotely connected to your sport. So if you wrote a book, you weren't allowed to get paid for that. And then they started to relax and saying you could earn money from things outside of playing the game. And that started to build. And then, but it wasn't until 1995, after the World Cup in South Africa, where they came out and said, I think the official statement from World Rugby or International Rugby Board at that stage, as they were known, was rugby is now an open game. And that's they couldn't even use the word professional, I think. And so then the doors were open, and it was just a free-for-all after that.
Did you find that was there ever a notably different incentive to playing rugby for the Wallabies? Did anyone kind of come in that later era where growing up as it was a professional sport, the incentive was more financial than the honour of putting on the yellow jersey? Because it's a special thing doing it for nothing, doing it only because it means so much, versus nowadays it obviously means a hell of a lot, but it also means
a job,
thousands of dollars and a job. Exactly. Did people's attitude shift at all?
I think it didn't shift immediately. I mean, ultimately, it was going to shift. It would be wrong to assume that it means any less for someone pulling on the gold jersey now. I don't believe that it does. I think it's exactly the same. But because it's so clearly their job, whereas when I came through, you had life outside of rugby, and even when I was professional, I had life outside of rugby. So for me, it became a career, but it was never what I wanted to do forever. So, whereas these guys coming in now, they know, okay, it's a career and they need to maximise it. And so I think there is a bit of a different mentality. And so you see a lot more people leaving to play overseas earlier because the money can be greater overseas for them. And, once it turned professional, you're going to get that. It's not like rugby league and AFL where if you're the best player in the world, you're getting paid the most to play in the Australian competition. In rugby, you can get paid well to play for Australia and in Australia, but you can probably get paid better, and sometimes significantly better, to go to Japan, to go to France, to go to England, to go to Ireland, a number of places. So once the genie was out of the bottle with professionalism, you were never going to... It's a bit like catching the wind. You're never going to stop that happening. So we're seeing a lot more guys go at a younger age now because they see it as their career. And while it would mean exactly the same for them to play for Australia, maybe their priorities are not to play for Australia as long. I mean, when I came through, I had 3 teams: Brothers Rugby Club in Brisbane, the Queensland Reds, and the Wallabies. And I played for a few Barbarians teams around the place: French Barbarians, British Barbarians, New Zealand Barbarians, Australian Barbarians. So invitation games here and there. I loved playing in them, and it really opened up the world. But I had no desire to go overseas and play for another club. And I see why people did have desire, but it just wasn't part of my makeup. I would have found it very hard to manufacture the same feelings playing for another club as I had playing for those 3. And so it was an easy decision for me not to go at the end of my career.
Setting the premise for my next question, hockey kind of finds itself at a crossroad, a long crossroads. Perhaps it'll go either way. We don't know, but. Is there anything you would have done differently at that junction of amateur to professional that can serve as perhaps advice to hockey players who find themselves in a similar state?
Yeah. Rugby didn't start from a blank sheet of paper and like hockey at the moment. But so when the money came in, it came in at different levels in different parts of the world. from different organisations wanting different things. And so it became this land grab. And, in some places it was the clubs that had more power. In Australia it was, from a national perspective, and same in New Zealand. But so we tended to then create structures that were around national and then interstate, which, provincial. So Queensland, New South Wales, Brumbies came in as a team that was exposed to that higher level as well. And look, that worked from our perspective because there was some control, but it made it difficult for the club rugby then to have the same presence as it did beforehand. So it's imperfect. I think if I was to give advice to hockey, it's if professionalism comes in a big way, then you need to start with a blank sheet of paper, and it needs to be a global blank sheet of paper. Because at the moment, even now, rugby it's sort of got a global season, but it doesn't really have a natural flow to the global calendar. It's trying to fix that, but it's fixing it in between things that are very fixed and rigid, and no one wants to move and no one wants to give away their power. The French competition doesn't want to give away the top 14 or doesn't want to compromise what they do there. And you understand that. But then Australia doesn't want to compromise. You've got some people that don't want to compromise Shoot Shield and the Hospitals Cup in New South Wales and Queensland, and other people that don't want to compromise Super Rugby, which is being reinvigorated at the moment. But if you could start with a blank sheet of paper across the whole landscape of the sport, then you could come up with something where everyone can have a seat at the table and it can be more meaningful. And actually it's being constructed in the new environment, whereas we've put a lot of band-aids on.
I hope the administrators have a chance to listen to the podcast, because that sounds like sage advice. You've been very generous with your time, and thanks very much for talking. I typically end the podcast with a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
And usually they're about the best hockey player you've ever played with, but that's probably not going to apply. But my two questions are, and I know this will be tough for you having played with so many people, but is there a teammate that you admire immensely that perhaps hasn't had the credit in the media that we might know about that they deserve, and who is it and why? Or they might have had the credit.
Yeah. Look, I think there's a saying in rugby that the most important person in a team is the tight head prop, and the second most important is the reserve tight head prop. And it says a lot about our sport, that saying. And because what it says is that it's a genuine team game, and the tight head prop rarely will get the coverage or the accolades that anyone else in the team will get. Most of the great work they do is done undercover, and but everyone in the team knows, or certainly everyone in the forwards knows, what that guy does. And I played with some great tight head props over the years, and some that haven't had the accolades. There might have been a Ewan McKenzie or a Andrew Blades or a Dan Crowley. They were masters at the dark arts of what they had to do, and they got their job done, and they're rarely seeking the glory. I mean, now we've got a guy called Taniela Tupou, Tongan Thor as he's known, and he can do everything. He's such an anomaly in that position. He could almost play in the backs. He's quick. He's incredibly skillful. He can do everything. That's generally not the mode of a tight head prop. Tight head prop has one job that's just so important, and it needs to be done every single time. So, look, I think if you could raise a glass to, if anyone in rugby has to raise a glass to anyone to say thank you, it's probably to the tight head props all around the world.
It's a good answer. Last question. Let's pretend that you're back in your athlete liaison officer role, and you're about to address a team or an individual athlete who is going to go out. Let's pretend you're in the back room, and they ask you for one piece of advice. Is there a universal piece of advice that you would give to someone who's about to embark on that journey?
Look, I think it's it'll be something around them clearing their head and trusting themselves. That'd be the thing, because if they're at the Olympics, they've done a hell of a lot of work. they've got the talent. They've got a hell of a lot of talent. They've done a hell of a lot of work. So I suppose in those final minutes that you've got to work with them, have a chat, it's giving them the courage, the confidence that they should have faith in themselves and trust the work they've done, trust the process they've been through, trust their teammates around them, and trust themselves.
Brilliant. Leave it there. Thanks, John.
No worries, Tom. It's a pleasure.
That's it for another episode of The Help Side. Special thanks to my production team of David Moore and Tim Collier, plus countless others working behind the scenes to get this to you. You're the real MVPs. Again, if you're liking the show, please like, subscribe, you know the drill, and get in touch with us via our socials. We would love to hear from you. Anyway, that's all, folks. See you next week.